Welcome to Big Breaking News of America. Genesis Episode 21. Engagement with Ancient Near Eastern Traditions in the Patriarchal Narratives, Genesis 12:36. The Patriarchal Narratives, Genesis 12:36, form a pivotal section of the book of Genesis, chronicling the lives of Abraham, Abram, Isaac, and Jacob, whose covenantal relationship with God lays the groundwork for Israel's identity as a chosen people. These chapters shift from the universal concerns of the primeval history, Genesis 1:11, creation, sin, and humanity's dispersion, to the particular story of a family through which God promises land, Canaan, descendants, a great nation, and blessing for all nations, Genesis 12:1-3. Organized by the Toledo Generations formula, the narratives weave episodic stories of faith, conflict, divine intervention, and human frailty into a cohesive arc that prepares for Israel's emergence in the Torah's later books, Exodus, Deuteronomy. The patriarchal narratives engage extensively with ancient Near Eastern traditions, drawing on Mesopotamian, Canaanite, Egyptian, and Hittite cultural, literary, religious, and social motifs to craft a narrative that resonates with its historical milieu while asserting a unique monotheistic theology. This engagement serves multiple purposes. It makes the stories relatable to ancient audiences familiar with regional conventions, critiques polytheistic worldviews, and establishes Israel's distinct identity as God's covenantal people. Likely finalized during the Babylonian exile, 587–539 BCE, the narratives reflect both the Middle Bronze Age, c. 2000–1500 BCE, setting of the patriarchs' lives and the exilic context of their composition, using ancient Near Eastern parallels to address theological and cultural challenges. This exploration examines the major areas of engagement, covenant and legal traditions, social and familial practices, religious and cultic motifs, narrative and literary parallels, and ethical and universal themes, highlighting specific examples, their theological transformations, and their cultural significance across Jewish tradition, interfaith theology, and global culture. 1. Covenant and legal traditions. The patriarchal narrative's covenantal framework, central to the theological arc of Genesis 12:36, engages with ancient Near Eastern legal and treaty traditions, particularly Mesopotamian and Hittite models, adapting them to assert a monotheistic divine-human relationship. Mesopotamian treaty parallels. The covenant ceremonies in Genesis 15, covenant between the pieces, and Genesis 17, circumcision covenant, resemble Mesopotamian suzerain vassal treaties, as seen in the Mari archives, c. 18th century BCE, and the Code of Hammurabi, c. 1754 BCE. These treaties involved a sovereign granting land or protection in exchange for loyalty, often sealed with rituals like animal sacrifices. In Genesis 15:7-21, God promises Abraham land and descendants, with a ritual where a divine fire pit passes through divided animals, echoing Babylonian treaty ceremonies where parties walked between animal halves to symbolize mutual obligation. However, God alone passes through, emphasizing divine initiative and unilateral commitment, unlike the bilateral nature of Mesopotamian pacts. The promise of land from the river of Egypt to the Euphrates, Genesis 15:18, mirrors Mesopotamian territorial grants, as seen in Akkadian inscriptions, but reframes the land as God's gift, countering imperial claims. Hittite legal influence. Abraham's purchase of the cave of Machpelah, Genesis 23:320, follows Hittite land transaction protocols, as evidenced by texts from Borzki, c. 14th century BCE, which detail formal negotiations and public witnesses. Abraham's dialogue with Ephron, specifying silver payment, Genesis 23:16, reflects Hittite legal precision, grounding the narrative in regional practices. Jacob's treaty with Laban, Genesis 31:44-54, marked by a stone pillar and shared meal, parallels Hittite peace agreements, which used boundary markers and communal rituals to seal alliances, as seen in treaties between Hatti and Mitanni. Theological transformation. The patriarchal narratives transform these legal traditions by centering the covenant on a single, transcendent God, rejecting polytheistic intermediaries common in Mesopotamian treaties, for example, invoking multiple deities. The universal blessing, Genesis 12:3, extends the covenant beyond tribal boundaries, contrasting with the localized focus of ancient Near Eastern pacts. Circumcision, Genesis 17:10-14, while practiced in Egypt and Canaan, becomes a unique covenantal sign, symbolizing spiritual and physical commitment to God, unlike its ritualistic role in regional contexts. The emphasis on divine faithfulness, God's unilateral commitment despite human frailty, for example, Abraham's doubts, Genesis 15:2-3, distinguishes the covenant from conditional ancient Near Eastern agreements, prefiguring the Torah's eternal covenant, Exodus 19:24. Historical context. The Middle Bronze Age setting, c. 2000–1500 BCE, aligns with the narrative's depiction of tribal alliances and land transactions, as seen in Mari and Nuzi texts. The exilic composition, 587–539 BCE, uses these parallels to counter Babylonian imperial ideologies, asserting God's sovereignty over history. The covenant's legal structure resonated with exilic audiences familiar with Babylonian administrative practices, offering hope for restoration through divine promises. Cultural significance. The engagement with legal traditions grounds the covenant in a recognizable framework, enhancing its credibility for ancient audiences and informing Jewish Brit Milah and liturgy, Avo prayer. It influences interfaith theology, with Christianity viewing the covenant as a precursor to salvation, Romans 4:16, and Islam honoring Ibrahim's covenant, Surah al-Baqarah 2:124. Globally, the covenant motif inspires narratives of commitment, from religious contracts to secular agreements, seen in literature and legal theory. 2. Social and familial practices. The patriarchal narratives reflect ancient Near Eastern social and familial practices, particularly in marriage, inheritance, and household dynamics, adapting these customs to highlight the covenantal family's unique role. Marriage and surrogacy. Abraham's arrangement of Isaac's marriage to Rebekah, Genesis 24, mirrors Mesopotamian marriage customs, as seen in Nuzi texts, where patriarchs secured brides from kin to maintain tribal alliances. The servant's negotiation with Laban's family, Genesis 24:50-60, reflects formal betrothal practices, with gifts, Genesis 2400 hours 53, paralleling dowry exchanges in Hammurabi's code. Hagar's role as a surrogate for Sarah, Genesis 16, aligns with Nuzi adoption contracts, where barren wives gave servants to bear children, who could inherit if no primary heir existed. However, Ishmael's exclusion from the covenantal line, Genesis 21:8-21, prioritizes divine election over customary inheritance, a theological shift. Jacob's marriages to Leah and Rachel, Genesis 29:15-30, reflect Mesopotamian polygamy and bride service, where grooms worked for the bride's family, as seen in Mari texts. Laban's deception, Genesis 29 hours 25 minutes, echoes regional trickery motifs but serves to fulfill divine plans, Genesis 29:31-35. Inheritance and sibling rivalry. The rivalry between Isaac and Ishmael, Genesis 21:8-21, and Jacob and Esau, Genesis 25:29-34-27, engages ancient Near Eastern inheritance disputes, where primogeniture favored the eldest son, as in Hammurabi's code. Esau's sale of the birthright, Genesis 25:31-34, and Jacob's deception, Genesis 27:18-29, subvert this norm, reflecting divine election, Genesis 25 hours 23 minutes, unlike regional reliance on birth order. Abraham's designation of Isaac as sole heir, Genesis 25:5-6, despite other sons, Genesis 25:1-4, contrasts with Mesopotamian equal inheritance laws, emphasizing the covenant's exclusivity. Household dynamics. The patriarch's semi-nomadic households, with servants, livestock, and extended kin, Genesis 12:5, 14:14, mirror Amorite tribal structures in Mari texts, where leaders managed large retinues. Abraham's armed rescue of Lot, Genesis 14:14-16, reflects tribal loyalty, akin to Ugaritic warrior codes. Women's agency, Sarah's initiative, Genesis 16:2, Rebekah's orchestration, Genesis 27:5-17, Rachel's theft of idols, Genesis 31:34-35, parallels the influence of women in Mesopotamian households, as seen in Nuzi texts, but their roles advance the covenant, highlighting divine guidance. Theological transformation. The narratives adapt familial practices to emphasize divine sovereignty over human customs. The choice of younger sons, Isaac, Jacob, reflects God's reversal of primogeniture, prefiguring Israel's election, Deuteronomy 7:6-8. Women's agency, while rooted in regional norms, serves theological purposes, with Sarah, Rebekah, and Rachel ensuring the covenantal line, foreshadowing the Torah's inclusive vision, for example, Miriam, Exodus 15:20-21. The inclusion of non-covenantal lines, Ishmael, Esau, with divine care, Genesis 21:17-21, 36, extends chaste, loving kindness, beyond regional tribalism, aligning with the universal blessing, Genesis 12:3. Historical context. The Middle Bronze Age setting provides a realistic backdrop, with marriage and inheritance practices matching archaeological and textual evidence. The exilic audience, facing family disruption, found hope in the patriarch's resilience and divine guidance. The narrative's critique of idolatry, for example, Rachel's idols, Genesis 31 hours 19 minutes, counters Babylonian polytheism, reinforcing monotheistic identity in exile. Cultural significance. The engagement with familial practices shapes Jewish family ethics, with shidduch, matchmaking, and Brit Milah drawing on Genesis 24 and 17. It informs interfaith narratives, with Islam honoring Hagar and Ishmael, Surah Ibrahim 14:37. Globally, the narrative's family dynamics inspire stories of loyalty, rivalry, and reconciliation, from religious texts to secular literature and film, for example, family sagas. 3 religious and cultic motifs. The patriarchal narratives engage with ancient Near Eastern religious and cultic practices, particularly Canaanite and Mesopotamian worship, adapting them to assert monotheism and covenantal theology. Canaanite cultic practices. The patriarch's construction of altars at Shechem, Bethel, and Hebron, Genesis 12:7, 28 hours 18 minutes, 35:17, parallels Canaanite open-air sanctuaries, as evidenced by archaeological finds at Megiddo and Gezer, c. 1800 BCE. These sites, associated with Baal worship in Ugaritic texts, are repurposed for monotheistic worship of YHWH, marking Canaan as God's land. The Bethel vision, Genesis 28:10-22, with Jacob's pillar and vow, echoes Canaanite sacred pillars, Matsevo, as seen in the Baal cycle, but Jacob's worship of one God rejects polytheism, aligning with the Torah's critique, Deuteronomy 12:2-3. Melchizedek, priest king of Salem, Genesis 14:18-20, resembles Canaanite priest kings in Ugaritic texts, who offered sacrifices to El. His blessing of Abraham in the name of God Most High, El Elyon, adapts Canaanite divine titles to affirm YHWH's supremacy, a theological innovation. Mesopotamian religious motifs. Abraham's rejection of idolatry, implied in his departure from Haran, Genesis 12:1, engages Mesopotamian polytheism, where cities like Ur and Haran were centers of moon god worship, Sin, as seen in cuneiform inscriptions. Bereshit Rabbah, 38 hours 13 minutes, amplifies this, portraying Abraham as smashing idols, a polemic against Babylonian religion. The divine human encounters, God's call, Genesis 12:1-3, the covenant between the pieces, Genesis 15:7-21, Jacob's ladder, Genesis 28:10-22, parallel Mesopotamian theophanies, where gods appeared to rulers, for example, in Numa Elish. However, the personal, covenantal relationship with one God contrasts with Mesopotamian transactional worship. The Sodom and Gomorrah judgment, Genesis 18:19, echoes Mesopotamian flood myths, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, where gods destroy corrupt cities. Abraham's intercession, Genesis 18:22-33, introduces monotheistic ethics, emphasizing mercy and justice, unlike capricious divine councils. Egyptian religious influence. Abraham's and Isaac's sojourns in Egypt and Gerar, Genesis 12:10-20, 26:6-11, engage Egyptian diplomatic practices, where pharaohs took foreign women into harems, as seen in Middle Kingdom texts. The plagues on Pharaoh, Genesis 12:17, foreshadow the Exodus, Exodus 7:12, critiquing Egyptian divine kingship by asserting YHWH's power. Circumcision, Genesis 17:10-14, common in Egypt as a priestly rite, Herodotus, Histories, is transformed into a covenantal sign, universalizing its spiritual significance for Israel's identity. Theological transformation. The narratives repurpose cultic practices to reject polytheism, with altars and pillars dedicated to YHWH, prefiguring the temple, 1 Kings 8. The universal blessing, Genesis 12:3, counters regional deities' localized power, asserting God's global sovereignty. Divine-human interactions emphasize personal relationship and ethical accountability, unlike Mesopotamian and Canaanite focus on ritual appeasement, aligning with the Torah's ethical monotheism, Deuteronomy 6:4-5. The inclusion of figures like Melchizedek and Hagar, Genesis 16:21, reflects divine care for outsiders, transforming tribal religiosity into a universal ethic, central to Israel's mission, Isaiah 42:6. Historical context. The Middle Bronze Age setting aligns with Canaanite cultic sites, while the exilic composition uses these parallels to critique Babylonian polytheism, reinforcing Jewish identity in diaspora. The narrative's monotheistic polemic resonated with exilic audiences, offering a theological alternative to Babylonian religion, as seen in 2nd Isaiah, Isaiah 44:9-20. Cultural significance. The engagement with cultic motifs shapes Jewish worship, with altars prefiguring synagogue practices and the Akedah, Genesis 22, central to Rosh Hashanah. It influences Christian and Islamic views of sacrifice and divine encounter. Globally, the narrative's religious themes inspire art, liturgy, and literature, from sacred architecture to stories of divine-human connection. 4 narrative and literary parallels. The patriarchal narratives draw on ancient Near Eastern narrative and literary conventions, including epic, moral, and trickster tales, adapting them to convey theological truths and covenantal identity. Mesopotamian epic and moral tales. The Sodom and Gomorrah story, Genesis 18:19, parallels Mesopotamian moral tales, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, Tablet 11, where divine judgment destroys corrupt societies. Abraham's intercession, Genesis 18:22-33, however, introduces a monotheistic dialogue, emphasizing justice and mercy, unlike the arbitrary divine councils in Babylonian myths. Abraham's migration, Genesis 12:19, echoes Mesopotamian epic journeys, such as Gilgamesh's quest for immortality, but Abraham's faith-driven journey to an unknown land, Genesis 12:1, prioritizes divine promise over personal glory, a theological shift. The flood-like imagery in Sodom's destruction, Genesis 19:24-25, recalls the Atrahasis flood narrative, but Genesis frames it as divine justice, prefiguring the Torah's ethical laws, Leviticus 19. Canaanite narrative motifs. Jacob's wrestling, Genesis 32:22-32, parallels Canaanite ritual combat myths, like Baal's battle with Mo in the Baal cycle, where divine struggles symbolize cosmic order. Jacob's encounter with a divine figure, earning the name Israel, transforms this motif into a personal, covenantal struggle, reflecting spiritual growth. The Dinah incident, Genesis 34, involving intermarriage and violence, engages Canaanite tales of tribal conflict, as seen in Ugaritic texts, but critiques assimilation, reinforcing Israel's distinct identity. Melchizedek's blessing, Genesis 14:18-20, resembles Ugaritic royal priestly narratives, but his monotheistic invocation elevates YHWH above Canaanite gods like El. Egyptian literary influence. The wife-sister motif, Genesis 12:10-20, 21:18, 26:6-11, parallels Egyptian diplomatic tales, like the Tale of Sinuhe, c. 1900 BCE, where foreigners navigate royal courts through deception. The narrative's emphasis on divine protection, for example, Genesis 12:17, critiques Egyptian divine authority, foreshadowing the Exodus. Rebekah's betrothal, Genesis 24, with its well-side encounter and providential signs, echoes Egyptian romantic tales, but the servant's prayer, Genesis 24:12-14, centers the story on divine guidance, a monotheistic innovation. Theological transformation. The narratives adapt epic and moral tales to emphasize divine sovereignty and human responsibility. Unlike Mesopotamian heroes seeking immortality, the patriarchs pursue covenantal promises, prefiguring Israel's mission, Exodus 19:6. Trickster motifs, like Jacob's deception, Genesis 27, common in Canaanite and Mesopotamian tales, are reframed as divine orchestration, Genesis 25:23, highlighting providence over cunning. The universal blessing, Genesis 12:3, transforms regional narratives into a global vision, aligning with the Torah's inclusive ethic, Leviticus 19:34. Historical context. The Middle Bronze Age setting provides a narrative backdrop, with epic and moral tales reflecting oral traditions. The exilic composition uses these parallels to engage Babylonian literary culture, asserting monotheistic superiority. The narrative's literary style, with vivid dialogue and repetition, suits oral recitation, resonating with ancient Near Eastern storytelling practices. Cultural significance. The engagement with narrative motifs shapes Jewish midrash, expanding stories like the Akedah, Genesis 22, and influences Christian and Islamic storytelling. Globally, the narrative's literary parallels inspire epic and moral tales, from religious texts to secular literature, theater, and film, broadening their cultural reach. 5 ethical and universal themes. The patriarchal narratives engage with ancient Near Eastern ethical and universal themes, particularly hospitality, justice, and divine human relationships, adapting them to assert monotheistic ethics and a global mission. Hospitality and chaste. Abraham's hospitality to the divine visitors, Genesis 18:18, parallels Mesopotamian and Canaanite hospitality codes, as seen in the Epic of Gilgamesh and Ugaritic texts, where hosts honor guests to gain divine favor. Abraham's selfless chaste, however, reflects monotheistic ethics, prefiguring the Torah's command to love the stranger, Leviticus 19:34. Lot's hospitality in Sodom, Genesis 19:13, contrasted with the city's inhospitality, Genesis 19:4-11, engages Mesopotamian moral critiques of urban decay, but the narrative's divine judgment underscores YHWH's ethical standards. Justice and mercy. Abraham's intercession for Sodom, Genesis 18:22-33, asking, "Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just?" Genesis 18:25 parallels Babylonian prayers for divine mercy, as seen in cuneiform texts. The monotheistic focus on justice and mercy, however, distinguishes the narrative, aligning with the Torah's ethical vision, Micah 6:8. The care for Hagar and Ishmael, Genesis 21:17-21, reflects ancient Near Eastern tribal obligations to protect kin, but God's universal compassion extends beyond the covenantal line, a theological innovation. Universal blessing. The promise that in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed, Genesis 12:3, engages ancient Near Eastern royal ideologies, where kings claimed divine favor for their people, as in Egyptian inscriptions. The narratives universalize this blessing, positioning Abraham's line as a conduit for global redemption, countering imperial exclusivity. The inclusion of non-covenantal figures like Melchizedek, Hagar, and Esau, Genesis 14:21-36, reflects ancient Near Eastern tribal alliances but elevates them to a theological ethic of inclusivity, prefiguring Israel's role as a light to the nations, Isaiah 42:6. Theological transformation. The narratives transform hospitality and justice into monotheistic virtues, rooted in chaste and divine accountability, unlike the transactional ethics of regional cultures. The universal blessing redefines ancient Near Eastern divine favor, making Israel's God the source of global blessing, a theme central to the Torah and prophetic vision, Isaiah 49:6. The ethical focus on human frailty and growth, seen in Jacob's transformation, Genesis 32:33, adapts regional moral tales to emphasize teshuvah, repentance, aligning with Jewish ethics. Historical context. The Middle Bronze Age setting grounds ethical themes in tribal practices, while the exilic composition uses them to counter Babylonian moral relativism, reinforcing Jewish identity. The narrative's universal themes resonated with exilic audiences, offering hope for restoration and a global role amidst displacement. Cultural significance. The engagement with ethical themes shapes Jewish tzedakah and chaste, influencing liturgy and social justice. It informs Christian charity and Islamic compassion, fostering interfaith ethics. Globally, the narrative's universal themes inspire human rights, hospitality, and inclusivity, seen in literature, philosophy, and humanitarian efforts. 6. Synthesis, a theological and cultural bridge. The engagement with ancient Near Eastern traditions in Genesis 12:36 serves as a theological and cultural bridge, grounding the patriarchal narratives in a familiar milieu while asserting a distinct monotheistic identity. The covenant adapts Mesopotamian and Hittite legal traditions to emphasize divine initiative, transforming tribal pacts into an eternal divine human partnership. Social and familial practices, from marriage to inheritance, reflect regional customs but prioritize divine election, highlighting the covenantal family's role. Religious and cultic motifs, like altars and divine encounters, repurpose Canaanite and Mesopotamian practices to affirm YHWH's supremacy, rejecting polytheism. Narrative parallels draw on epic and moral tales, reframing them to underscore divine sovereignty and human responsibility. Ethical and universal themes, such as hospitality and justice, elevate regional virtues into a global monotheistic ethic, centered on the universal blessing. Rooted in the Middle Bronze Age and shaped by the exilic context, these engagements make the narratives accessible to ancient audiences while addressing theological challenges, ensuring their relevance for Jewish identity and beyond. The Patriarchal Narratives dialogue with ancient Near Eastern traditions influences Jewish tradition, interfaith theology, and global culture, shaping liturgy, ethics, art, and literature, and preparing for the Torah's redemptive arc. Archaeological and textual contributions. Archaeological finds, Mari, Nuzi, Ugarit, and texts, Amana letters, Hammurabi's code, corroborate the narrative's cultural details, informing biblical studies and public interest in ancient history. Comparative studies enhance understanding of the narrative's theological innovation, highlighting their adaptation of regional motifs. Cultural and religious impact. In Jewish tradition, the engagement informs Torah study, liturgy, Avo, Rosh Hashanah, and ethics, reinforcing covenantal identity. In Christianity, the narrative's universal themes ground salvation history, with Abraham's faith and the Akedah central to theology, Romans 4, Hebrews 11. In Islam, the engagement resonates in Ibrahim's legacy, Surah al-Baqarah 2:124, influencing Hajj and interfaith dialogue. Globally, the narrative's cultural parallels inspire stories of faith, ethics, and universal hope, from religious texts to secular media. Contemporary relevance. The engagement informs interfaith dialogue, with Abrahamic traditions citing Genesis 12:3 to promote peace and shared heritage. It supports archaeological and literary studies, enriching education and tourism in biblical sites like Hebron and Shechem. The narrative's universal themes address modern issues, migration, ethics, inclusivity, offering wisdom for pluralistic societies. 7. Conclusion, a dynamic engagement. The engagement with ancient Near Eastern traditions in Genesis 12:36 creates a dynamic interplay between familiarity and innovation, grounding the patriarchal narratives in their historical and cultural context while asserting a transformative monotheistic theology. By adapting covenantal, social, religious, narrative, and ethical motifs from Mesopotamian, Canaanite, Egyptian, and Hittite traditions, the narratives resonate with ancient audiences, critique polytheistic worldviews, and establish Israel's unique covenantal identity. The Middle Bronze Age setting and exilic composition enhance their relevance, addressing ancient and modern questions of faith, identity, and community. This engagement shapes Jewish tradition through liturgy, ethics, and study, influences Christian and Islamic theology, and inspires global cultural narratives, from art to human rights. As a bridge between ancient Near Eastern heritage and monotheistic vision, Genesis 12:36 prepares for the Torah's broader arc, offering timeless insights into divine-human partnership and universal hope. Thank you for watching Big Breaking News of America. Make sure to subscribe and turn on the bell icon for more news updates. Share our channel with your friends and family members, leave a like for more videos and express your thoughts under comment section.